Hey everybody, this is just a revised version of an earlier presentation I did on Gog and Magog. I just wanted to make some corrections and have it a little more focused and less confusing with some new information. Now I'm sure you've had many of the same questions that I've had about just who Gog is and when will these events described in the prophecies happen. Have they already happened, or are they still going to happen, or partially happened in the past? When will it be completely fulfilled? The first image that comes to my mind when I think of Gog and Magog is this dark apocalyptic figure coming out of the north, out of Asia, Russia somewhere, coming down into Israel and taking over the world, and then being miraculously destroyed and defeated by some angelic army, something like that. And you wonder if Gog is just some symbolic figure or if this is some real event. And again, has it already happened or is it still going to happen? You'll often hear it's World War III, Armageddon, something like that. You can find tons of videos on YouTube alone about Gog and Magog and in other places, and they will almost always tell you that Gog and Magog is some Russian army coming out of the north, coming down to Israel, and it's some World War III apocalyptic battle. And I would say that a lot of the information is false, and it may even be on purpose, and a lot of it is coming from churches. So the first good question to ask is just who or what is Gog, and what does the name of Gog mean? And I would tell you that Gog is the same as Agog in the Old Testament. The first clue is that in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, Agog is written as Gog. Agog was the title of a king of the Amalekites, and he appears in the book of Samuel in the Bible. The name Agog appears earlier in the Bible in the prophecy of the wicked prophet Balaam, where he connects Agog to the Amalekites and predicts their downfall. Strong's Concordance will give you two meanings for the name. One is flame, and the other is a title of Amalekitish kings. What looks like Agog should actually be pronounced Gog, since the first A in the word is actually silent. This is known as a glottal stop. And also, this is from the original Hebrew text, which didn't include vowels, so both words, Agog and Gog, would actually be originally written just GG. This name or title is also clearly related to the word Gog, which means roof, housetop, topmost, and also to another word, Ga'ah, which has several forms, and they all have the meanings of something that is lofty, proud, arrogant, haughty. Now, if the name or title Gog was connected to the Amalekites, this also connects it to the Edomites. Amalek, the father of the Amalekites, was the grandson of Esau or Edom, and Esau also incidentally married into a Hittite branch. And we'll see later that the name Gog seems to appear also among the Hittites, who ruled from as far as Palestine up into Asia Minor or Anatolia, what is now known as Turkey. As far as records outside of the Bible, there are Assyrian records which refer to a king Gugu of Mot Gugu, which may mean Gugu of the land of Mot Gugu, and this Mot Gugu has been associated with Magog. And it's also interesting that Magog may have lived in that area. This may be unconnected to Gog, and Magog is listed in the Table of Nations in chapter 10 of the Bible as one of the sons of Japheth. There are also existing records of a king Googas of Lydia or Ludia, which is in western Anatolia on the coast. The Hittites never ruled this area directly, but they did have a lot of influence there. This Googas, his name is often pronounced Gyges, but I think the correct pronunciation is Googas. And by the way, there's an interesting story that it's found in the writings and teachings of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. He had a lesson, and for his lesson he used this strange story of a king Googas. And this King Googas had found, in the story, he had found a magic ring. And strangely, he found it in a cave where a giant had been buried, and he found this magic ring on the finger of this giant, and it gave this King Googas all kinds of power. the story is related by Aristotle as just a lesson for how power and absolute power corrupt. But it's curious where he got this story from, and it's interesting that a giant is connected to the king Googas, and we often think of Gog as being a giant or some giant race. Many scholars have connected this king Googas of Lydia with Gog in Ezekiel's prophecy in the Bible, and I find it interesting that this king Googas is connected to magic rings and giants. We know that giants were one of the main enemies of Israel in the Bible, and rings do appear in ancient legends. There are legends of the Scythian ring lords, and the Scythians were connected to an area close to where Googas ruled in Lydia. And history shows that the kingdom of Lydia had a lot of influence on the Greeks. When they came into the coast of Anatolia and began to rule there, they surely knew of the stories of Lydia. This may explain how Aristotle got the story of Googas, and this also may explain how the Greek language has the word Gog, and this has the meaning of to lead, and this would have something to do with a king as a leader. And they also have the word gigantic, which may come from the name Gog. And this is found in words that come from the Greek language, like synagogue, which means to lead together, demagogue, which means to lead the people, hemagogue, which means to lead blood. And all these show a clear influence from Asia Minor and the kingdom of Lydia and the Hittites and the people of Gog. So apparently many Bible scholars believe that Ezekiel's prophecy about Gog has already occurred, because they connect Gog in the prophecy with King Googas of Lydia, and he reigned around the 500s BC. And it is puzzling that what's described in the prophecy seemed to be something from ancient times and not now. We hear of horses, swords, shields, bucklers, spears, and also a lot of the weapons seem to be wooden, because we're told that they're burned for fuel by the people after Gog's army is destroyed. Others will say that the prophecy has not yet happened because it speaks about Russia, which didn't exist at that time, but they use a translation of the prophecy that uses the word Rosh. They think that means Russia, but actually the word just means chief or head. So some other translations will say that Gog is the chief prince, the head prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now, I will say that Meshech has been connected to Russia or some Russian tribe, because the Assyrian name for Meshech was Musku, which many connect to Moscow, and this could be true, but that may have been just one tribe of Slavic or Russian people at that time, not the whole nation of Russia. And also, Gog is the chief prince of Tubal, which has been connected to Tobolsk in Siberia, which is also Russia, or part of Russia. So you have two different sides here, the future or the past fulfillment. And I'll just add that the phrase chief prince or head prince seems to connect Gog to the Amalekites again. If you remember, the ancient prophecy of Balaam said that the Amalekites would be the first of the nations, and that could mean the leader of the nations or head of the nations. And this depicts Gog as an antichrist figure leading the nations into destruction, just like they're led into destruction at the Battle of Armageddon. This is tied to the name in Ezekiel's prophecy for the Valley of Haman Gog. This name literally means the Valley of the Multitudes or Nations of Gog. And I tie this to the villain in the book of Esther, Haman the Agagite. The name sounds a lot like Haman Gog. In fact, many scholars have connected the name Agagite to the Amalekites through Agag. And he is something we would expect for a villain in the book. The Amalekites would be depicted as villains, but I see a big problem. The book of Esther, I think, should actually not be in the Bible. It was actually rejected by many early churches and bishops. It was kept in the Bible in Jerome's Latin Vulgate version only because the Jews liked the book. And this is a big clue. I have some notes in this video of just who all rejected the book of Esther in the early church period. So with the book of Esther, we see a villainous Amalekite, which is just what we would expect. But the problem is that the roles are actually reversed. This is something that the Jews often do as one of their tactics. They'll use lies, calumny, and projection against their enemies, projection is where you accuse someone of doing something that you're actually doing, or that they are something that you actually are. So you have to ask, are the Jews actually the Amalekites, and is Gog their leader? Another thing with the book of Esther is that in the Septuagint version, Haman the Agagite in one place is called Haman Macedon, and this has led many scholars to connect the Agagites or Amalekites to the Macedonians. And I would say this is just another tactic. The Jewish scribes just wanted to connect Alexander the Great, who apparently was their enemy, to their enemy Haman the Agagite. So this is saying that Alexander the Great and the Macedonians and maybe even all the Greeks were Amalekites. This is something that they've often done to their enemies, and I'll go over later how they did that to the Armenians. The Amalekites and Edomites would certainly want to hide their identity or change their identity. They probably know of the many prophecies that tell of their utter destruction, so they would logically point the finger at other people and confuse just who are the Amalekites. And they apparently did this to Alexander the Great, to other whole nations, and later even the Armenians. Some other details of Ezekiel's prophecy are a bit confusing, but they also shed light on the events. One thing is that it says that Gog will come into the land of unwalled villages and attack a people living in peace. We think of unwalled villages, though, as something more modern. We don't have walled cities anymore, so this may be pointing to a future event. And it also says that Gog comes into the land of Israel, or the mountains of Israel. Now, is this symbolic? Is this any place, or is this the actual land of Palestine that used to be inhabited by the Israelites, or is it places around the world where they live? It's not quite clear. And another thing is it says that the people will be brought back from captivity, and they will be ashamed of the sins that they've committed in other lands. But it also says that it will be after Gog invades. So we have a picture of people living in peace as if they'd already come back from captivity, but then we're told that the captivity doesn't end until after Gog is defeated. And it's also not clear if there is an army that defeats Gog. It seems to say that God himself will defeat Gog with an earthquake. And it's interesting also that the earthquake is described in other prophecies, or seems to be, and also in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, we're told of a sacrifice, and that's also mentioned in the prophecy about Gog, a sacrifice of people dying. We also hear in this prophecy that Gog and his hordes will be buried in the land of Israel. So if this already happened in the past, we should be able to find a lot of bodies in Israel. Have they already been looking for these, or have they already been found and we just haven't been told? Another thing is that this prophecy could be true even if it's fulfilled in different parts at different times. So there could have been invasions of Gog and his armies in the past, but the final fulfillment won't take place until the future with an earthquake or something else like that. So it could still be true, even if not completely fulfilled now, and to be fulfilled partly in the future. Now, if you accept that Ezekiel's prophecy of Gog is referring to the Amalekites, this would refute arguments that the Amalekites were actually removed out of the land of Israel earlier when the tribes of Israel conquered Palestine, but the Amalekites could have easily lived on outside of Israel and could have come back into Israel with the Edomites when they moved into Judea, when the tribe of Judah was exiled out of the land, and other tribes of Israel. The Edomites were converted to Judaism, which at that time was just a corrupted and perverted form of the original commandments given by God. This conversion probably included Amalekites, and many of them would become Pharisees later on. According to some interpretations of the Bible, a shadowy people known as the Dynasties were brought into Israel with many others when the tribes of Israel were exiled. And according to the historian Josephus, the Dynasties were from Armenia originally. Apparently they were taken from there in the Assyrian conquest of that region. And we know that the Edomites, and probably the Amalekites with them, had come into Judea and other parts of Israel with the exile of the tribes of Israel. Records also clearly show that the Herodian dynasty was of Edomite origin, or partly Edomite, and according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, the Herodian kings were related to the kings of Armenia. And according to the historian Josephus, when Jerusalem was destroyed around 70 AD, many of the elites of Jerusalem and Judea fled into Armenia. So here we can see some clear links with the land of Judea and Jerusalem, with the Amalekites and Edomites, and the land that is now Turkey today. And I'll just add that especially in the eastern parts of Turkey, there were some strange kingdoms that had developed in the time of the Persians, Greeks, and even the Romans. These were like the kingdoms of Commagena and Mithridates. These had a strange mixture of Persian and Greek elements, also Mesopotamian, Roman, and Hittite elements, and an increasing Turco-Mongol element. So you just have to ask if this strange mixture of kingdoms in Asia Minor, or what is now Turkey, and the Caucasus and Black Sea regions was also reflected in Bible prophecy, like prophecies of Daniel, Ezekiel, and also the book of Revelation. They seem to suggest that the Antichrist system is this hybrid of Persian, Greek, Roman, Babylonian culture. And in the book of Daniel, we see also what's called the king of the north and the king of the south, and also apparently a third king. You might say that these were actually just the Greek kingdoms that were left after Alexander the Great, but these kingdoms were probably also corrupted by Mesopotamian, Hittite, Greek, and Persian culture, and also the culture that had come from Judea. Asia Minor has long been known as the land where East meets West, and it's no accident that very powerful cities like Troy, Constantinople, and Pergamum were there. Pergamum is even called Satan's seat by Christ himself in the book of Revelation. All of the nations that are led by Gog in Ezekiel's prophecy, except Ethiopia and Libya, are from that region, and some scholars even argue that Libya and Ethiopia, according to their original terms in the original text, Put and Cush, are actually nations that are from Mesopotamia and not Africa. Gomer has been connected to the ancient Cimmerians, which were usually found in the Black Sea region, Russia, even as far as the Balkans and northern Greece. As I said before, Meshech would be a Russian tribe, usually connected to a Russian tribe. Tubal is connected to Siberia. The Persians are Iranian. Notice also that nowhere in Gog's armies mentioned in Ezekiel's prophecy are Armenians found. If that were so, we would see the names Ararat and Mini. And even though I've said that the Armenians were connected to Judea, Jews, the Edomites, Amalekites, this would be through the kings of Armenia and not necessarily all the people of Armenia. Also appearing from this land was a people known as the Khazars, and I would connect them to the Huns. They appeared at about the same time. I would even go so far as to say that Attila the Hun himself was a Khazar, or partly a Khazar, and was actually a leader of the Huns, and only partly Hun. And Attila's army is an exact picture of Gog's army. It's a perfect fit. It didn't come down into Israel, actually, but it came close. And if you believe that many of the tribes of Israel went into Europe, then Attila's attack on Europe would be something that Satan would do through Gog's armies to destroy the people of Israel. Now the Khazars extended their power from lands around Armenia into the Caucasus region, the lands between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and north into the steppe lands, which are now Russia. There is a story that the Khazars converted to Judaism, or at least some of their rulers and priests, in the 700s AD, but I would say that many of them were already Jews as far back as the destruction of Jerusalem, and even earlier. Also, the Khazars were in contact with the Jews of Spain, and there are existing letters from the 900s AD between Joseph, king of the Khazars, and the respected Jewish scholar Haste ibn Shaprat. Shaprat had even traced the people of King Joseph to none other than Mount Seir, which is in the old Edomite lands mentioned in the Bible. And the Khazars were also in conflict with the Byzantine Empire, and they would often marry into some of the ruling families of Byzantium and even Arab ruling families. The Khazars may explain why there were some strange dynasties in Byzantium like the Isaurians, who were known for their brutality. And I just noticed how Isaurian sounds a lot like Esau. As the Khazars extended westward, they were turned back by a league of Slavic, Finnish, and Viking elements. They were finally defeated in 1016 AD by the Viking king Rurik, but they regrouped and joined the Tatars in 1238 AD under the Mongol Batu Khan. They joined the Golden Horde and joined also with Persians, Asian Kuthites, and others from Mesopotamia, and they would terrorize lands that are now part of southern Russia. The Asian Kuthites of Mesopotamia quite possibly could be the same as the Kushites of Mesopotamia. These people are also mentioned in the Bible as having been transplanted into Samaria by the Assyrians when they exiled the Israelites out of the land. From Samaria they could easily move into Judea and Jerusalem. The empire of the Mongol hordes is also a very good fit for Gog and his armies, just like Attila and his Hun armies. In fact, at the time of the Mongols were believed to be a harbinger of the apocalypse. They themselves had actually come into Israel. They had destroyed Baghdad in 1258 AD, but they were turned back in 1260 AD at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Israel by a Muslim army from Egypt. But it is interesting that the Mongols were able to come into the Middle East and Israel just at a time when both Muslim armies and Christian armies had been weakened through centuries of fighting in the Crusades. Now, the next good fit for Gog and his armies would be the Turkish Empire. The Turks also were able to come into Palestine like the Mongols. They actually took it over in 1517, and they ruled it for 400 years along with the whole Middle East. But the Turkish Empire also was a strange mixture of Persian, Greek, Roman, Mesopotamian elements, along with the Turco-Mongol element. And the Turks believed themselves to be inheritors of the old Roman Empire, especially when they took over Constantinople in 1453 AD. But it's also very interesting that at the time of the fall of the Turkish Empire, many of its leaders were actually Jews, and most, if not all of them, were known Freemasons. These had a lot of influence in Turkey, much of Europe, and Britain. And in Turkey, they were known as Donme Jews, which means Jews disguised as Muslims. These Donme Jews were no doubt behind the Armenian genocide. They would use the old trick of projection and justify it by claiming that the Armenian people were Amalekites, when in fact the Donme Jews were the Amalekites. It's also interesting that Ezekiel's prophecy has a line about Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, where they seem to rebuke Gog for coming into Israel for a spoil. Most scholars associate Sheba and Dedan with Arab countries, and the merchants of Tarshish could very well refer to the British. It's interesting that when the Turks lost control of Palestine in 1917, the Arabs had been promised Palestine for helping fight the Turks in World War I, but the British cheated the Arabs out of Palestine at the end of the war. It's interesting, though, if it was actually the Jews that cheated the Arabs in the double cross. So was it actually Jews behind the scenes in the British Empire and the Turkish Empire, as well as even in the Arab kingdoms? By the way, Donme Jews also became the Saudi regime in Arabia. So we might think that some army of Gog is going to come into the land of Israel and maybe the rest of the whole world at some future time in this apocalyptic end times battle. But maybe Gog and his army are already in Israel. It's right under our noses, hidden in plain sight. Is it the Jews that are in the land now? They came in 1948 with the creation of the so-called nation of Israel. According to the Bible, Esau, Edom, and probably including the Amalekite branch, would want to come into Israel and retake the land. They said that they would want to retake the wastes and build the old cities, build the old high fortresses. Is this the nation of Israel, the so-called people of God, coming into the land and stealing the identity of the people of Israel? It seems to be an epic historical hoax, identity theft of massive proportions. We last hear of Gog and Magog in the book of Revelation, and it seems to be the final destruction of Gog and his army. It's a bit different from Ezekiel's prophecy, and it may be that it's the final fulfillment after many stages. And if you remember that in prophetic terms, 1,000 years is as one day, and a day as 1,000 years. You could have Ezekiel's prophecy fulfilled over 1,000 or 2 years in battles, in time, and there would be a final conclusion, but all fulfilled in time in the last days, which could be over a long period of time for us. And I'll just leave you with a few final thoughts. In the prophecy of Ezekiel, it's actually God that brings Gog upon the mountains of Israel, so it's clearly God that's in control. And I have to ask, if Gog is just a title, how can you bury a title in Israel? Is Gog actually a man or several men or just a spirit? I would point to the image in the book of Revelation where we see Satan being bound in the bottomless pit. That would be something like burying Gog in Israel, or possibly. Notice also that in the prophecy of Ezekiel, God tells Gog that he will put hooks in his jaws. This sounds like some kind of fish or sea creature taken up out of the waters. God says the same thing in the book of Job to Leviathan, which is clearly some kind of sea creature and also a dragon. And God says the same thing to Pharaoh of Egypt, who is also likened to a dragon. So you have to wonder if Gog has some connection to a sea creature. The British Empire was the supreme power of the sea, but lost that at World War I. And you have to wonder if in its dealings with Palestine and the Arabs and the Turks, it was trying to regain that power, but it was actually coming to land. Another important thing that is probably connected to Gog is the star and crescent symbol. A lot of people think it's a Muslim symbol, but it was around long before Islam. The Hittites probably knew of it, and it was certainly the symbol for Byzantium and Constantinople, which it became later, even Istanbul. The Turks carried it on their banners, and it's on the flag of modern Turkey today. It was probably carried into China by the Hittites. There is a theory that the Hittites went into the east when the Hittite Empire was broken up, and they became the Khitai tribe, which became a dynasty in China. China was known for a long time as Cathay, and it's believed that this name was derived from the Khitai tribe. And it's interesting that if you look on the flag of the People's Republic of China today, you'll see a star and crescent pattern. There are 4 small stars arranged in a crescent and one big star. The star and crescent represents the goddess known as Diana, Artemis, and other names in her 3 aspects. One as huntress, one as moon goddess, and one as Hecate, goddess of the underworld. The big star represents Hecate's torch, and the crescent represents the moon goddess. It's also curious that the hammer and sickle symbol of the old Soviet Union looks like a star and crescent. Russia was part of the Soviet Union, but it was controlled by the Soviets, and they were controlled by the Bolsheviks, who were almost all Jews. It's interesting also that the flag of the old Soviet Union was colored red, just like the flag of the so-called People's Republic of China. Red is clearly the color of Esau, Edom, also the Amalekites, communism, blood, and war. The Soviet Union is also a very good match for Gog, and you have to wonder if it really is extinct or if it disguised itself and took on a new form and even expanded into China. I'll leave you with one final thought. I admit it's just speculation, but I think it is worth looking more into. I had mentioned the Mongol invasion of Israel and their defeat at the Battle of Ain Jalut. Ain Jalut is named after a spring. It actually means the well of Goliath. It's interesting that this is in an area where many battles were fought. In fact, most of the important battles in Israel were in this area. It's just south of Galilee. There are a lot of interesting places in that region. It adjoins the Jezreel Valley, which is a natural invasion point from the east. Deborah fought in this region, Gideon, Saul at the Battle of Mount Gilboa, and there are also some other interesting points. Mount Tabor is nearby, and many people believe that Jesus was transfigured there. There's also the Well of Herod, which is believed to be the same as the Well of Goliath. Herod means trembling, and it figures in the account of Gideon. There's also Endor, which is also a spring. It means the Well of Turning, or possibly Well of Eternity. And we all know of the story of the Witch of Endor, where she was able to see into a pit, into the earth, and she was able to see spirits coming up out of it. You might wonder if this is something like the bottomless pit. and this may be where Gog is buried, and this may be Satan, and we also hear an account of that in the book of Revelation, where Satan is bound in the bottomless pit. I just wanted to let you know that the first 2 chapters of an English translation of the Handbook of the Jewish Question by Theodore Fritsch are now available for free at truthtransfusion.com. You can just go to the library and download the PDF there, and the rest of the translation will be coming soon. And I'll just leave that there for now, so until next time.